My name is Tim Besley. I'm the current president of the Royal Economic Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event on the gender imbalance in UK economics. What we're going to be doing this evening is to have a panel discussion with a group of experts and different perspectives on this issue. An enormously important and challenging issue in our profession and has been for many years. I want to stress before I hand over to our first speaker that this isn't just an inward-looking debate where economists are looking at themselves. It has much wider implications because economists are members of, in a broad sense, of civil society. The kind of research that we do, the questions we ask are a reflection of our makeup as economists. And so it's not just about the profession as such, but it's also about the way collectively we see the world and we contribute to the world. So the issues we're dealing with this evening, I think, are much more important than just being about economics. We have a superb panel, as I mentioned, and I'll introduce them as we go. And the pretext for this event was the report from the Women's Committee. And I'm very pleased to say that we have Victoria Bateman from the University of Cambridge, who's going to begin the panel by discussing the report, its main findings, and the kinds of lessons that we draw from that. We'll then hear four perspectives, and I'll introduce the four speakers as we go, to comment on how they see the issues from their own particular point of view. And then there'll be plenty of opportunity later in the webinar for some interaction with the panel and the audience. So I'll begin by inviting Victoria to give us an overview of the very important report that they published back in July, and to allow you to, at least we'll begin by looking at the broad themes and results from that. So Victoria, over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to try sharing my screen. So let me pull up my PowerPoint for you. Okay, can we see that? Can you see that, Tim?
Yeah, we're good.
Great, perfect. Well, it was 25 years ago that the Royal Economic Society established a Women's Committee with the goal of monitoring the gender balance amongst academic economists here in the UK. And as Tim says, it was this summer that we released our silver anniversary report, drawing together the Women's Committee's own historic data collection, which has been going on really since the beginning, with new data from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, to look at what's happened over the last quarter of a century. And what we find is a mixed bag of improvement, stagnation, and retreat. And I want to start with the improvement, and that's the top left-hand corner here. As things stand, 26% of academic economists in the UK are women. Now that's up from what was at best 18% a quarter of a century ago. Looking at a more granular level, so that's the bottom left corner of the screen, you can see that today women comprise 33% of economics lecturers, 27% of senior lecturers and readers, and 15% of professors. And all of these are significantly higher than they were 25 years ago. The problem is that progress has now begun to stall, particularly at the lecturer end of things and the professor end of things. And this stalling has happened well before we've reached gender balance. So it seems that closing the gender gap isn't simply a matter of more time. And in addition to this stagnation, what we also find are signs of retreat. Let's begin with students. Women actually comprise a smaller proportion of economics students today than they did 10 or even 20 years ago. And here I'm focusing on UK domiciled economics students. If we look at undergraduates, 27% of UK domiciled economics undergraduates in the UK are women. That's down from more than 30% 20 years ago. Master's students, 31%. Again, that's down from 37% 20 years ago. If we look at the PhD students, 32% of UK domiciled PhD students are women. That's no different to where it was 10 years ago. So not only do we have what we all know is a leaky pipeline within economics, we also have a shrinking pipeline. This is not a good sign for the future. Now, how does economics look once we factor in ethnicity? Well, at the undergraduate level, the proportion of women amongst minority groups is actually higher than amongst white students. But economics then does a terrible job of retaining and promoting minority women. This is quite a powerful statistic that came from our report. We couldn't find a single Black female professor of economics anywhere in the UK for the whole period for which we had data from the Higher Education Statistics Agency. This is pretty good data, and it runs from 2012 to 2018. Moreover, what we also found was that the percentage of economics professors with Asian ethnicity who are women has been falling. And so too has the proportion of Black lecturers who are women. So it seems that economics is really struggling to attract women, to then retain them when it does attract them, and to promote them. And in many ways, this problem is getting worse rather than better. Alarm bells really should be ringing, I think, at this point. Now, while academic economics in the UK is in some ways moving backwards, outside of academic economics, there is more hope. So here we have the female percentage across various other economic bodies in the UK. In the Treasury, 38% of economists are women. At the Bank of England, 32% of senior staff, and around about a half of the graduate intake. And at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the National Institute of Economics and Social Research, more than 40% of researchers are women. There's a lot, I think, therefore, that we can learn from these and other experiences. And that's, of course, why we have our panel with us today. The question is, I think, whether those with the most power to make a difference beyond the Royal Economic Society in departments up and down the UK, whether they're willing to stand up and listen to what our panel and others have to say. To my mind, the problem isn't women, the problem is economics, and academic economics in particular. University departments can't carry on as they're doing and simply expect improvement to continue or improvement to occur. What we need is change, and that change needs to be informed by best practice, by what's worked elsewhere. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand back to Tim so we can hear about the change that's happening elsewhere with the expert knowledge of our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. That's extremely insightful and useful. We're now going to turn to our panel to discuss some of these findings and to offer a perspective on them. I'm going to begin with Misa Tanaka from the Bank of England. She's the head of research there, which, as we saw, actually has a more equal gender balance compared to academia. But I'd be very curious to hear from Misa how she sees it from her Bank of England perspective. So over to you, Misa. I think you're still on mute, Misa.
Sorry about that. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, first of all, I wanted to congratulate Victoria and the authors for the fantastic report. And second of all, I also wanted to say that I was very disappointed to show how little progress has been made in UK academic economics. And it's really in stark contrast to the progress made elsewhere in the professions occupied by economists. And so I just wanted to ask the question, where next now, and what actions are being taken to correct for this gender imbalance? So let me talk briefly about what's been happening outside the academic economics. So take, for example, Women in Finance Charter, which is a commitment initiated in March 2016 by the Treasury and signatory firms to improve gender balance across financial services. And now this charter has over 400 signatories, and these firms have pledged to having at least one member of senior executive team who is responsible and accountable for gender diversity and inclusion. These firms also agreed to set internal targets for gender diversity in senior management and publish progress annually against these targets. They also pledged having an intention to ensure the pay of the executive team is linked to delivery against these internal targets on gender diversity. And if you look at the recent report published by the Treasury on as a 5-year review, you do see a step change in women in senior position in finance. So if you look at the left-hand side chart, you see that the executive committee and boards have increased share of women from 2016 and 2021. And if you look at the right-hand side chart, you can see that the signatory firms have outperformed those that have not signed up to this charter. Bank of England is also a signatory to this charter, and I had the opportunity to observe what's been happening inside the bank. And I just wanted to talk to you briefly about what's been happening. I mean, there's been many initiatives over the years to improve gender diversity in the bank, but here I will focus on what's been done specifically to improve diversity in senior positions. So the bank first started publishing targets for the share of women and BAME staff in senior management in 2014. And to achieve this target, a senior person, a deputy governor level person, has been put in charge and delivery against these targets. And to make this happen, a couple of things have been done. The first is pooled recruitment for senior management positions. So this is a method to fill in several senior management positions at once to ensure that collectively the people that fill in these positions achieve our diversity objectives. In addition, there has been a targeted sponsorship program, which has been rolled out to women, BAME staff, and also staff with disability just below the senior management levels, in order to ensure that they get targeted career advice, but also given opportunity to develop skills and experiences that would enable them to move to the next level. And those in the senior management positions also receive training regularly for inclusive leadership, which means that we are trained to think about bias and microaggressions on a regular basis, and trained not to identify these problems in our day-to-day work. I think what was most important in all this is that these diversity and inclusion initiatives have been very loudly and also repeatedly endorsed by the top management, i.e. the governors. And you can see that several governors in the past have actually given speeches on this topic, as I've put in the footnote here. And these initiatives have paid off. So as you can see here, the share of women in senior management in the bank has increased from 17% in 2013 to 2021 to 32% in 2021. And that still falls short of the target that we set ourselves, but it's been for an insider, it's been a concrete and visible progress over a pretty short period of time. Now, I'm not going to say that the same formula should be applied in academic economics, but I would like to note that other disciplines are now moving on from just simply counting number of women to taking concrete actions. So take, for example, the initiatives by the Royal Society of Chemistry. They have actually identified systemic barriers that are stopping women's progression. And that includes over-reliance on short-term funding structures, unsupportive academic culture, and also difficulty in balancing academic work with caring responsibilities. They have also publicly recognized anecdotal evidence of harassment and bullying as well. Interestingly and impressively, actually, the RSC have also come up with action plan for rectifying gender imbalance. And that includes launching a bullying and harassment helpline and also launching of carers grants in early 2019. So let me conclude here. I mean, I think there's a lot for academic economics, academia really, to learn from experiences of economic professions outside academia as well as other disciplines. And I think there's now ample evidence that culture in academic economics hasn't been particularly supportive of women. And laissez-faire, actually, as Victoria had pointed out, laissez-faire has failed to work. So I think it's very important that the Royal Economic Society, as well as the heads of departments, to draw up an action plan and make a senior person responsible and accountable for the delivery of such an action plan within a well-defined time frame. Without these actions, gender imbalance is not going to be rectified. And I think there's been some good initiatives, such as the new mentoring program for women, as well as the Discovery Economics, to reach out to a diverse range of young talents to encourage them to study economics. But in order to rectify gender imbalance at senior levels, you also need very targeted interventions at mid-career levels. And to make all this happen, those occupying the top positions of the discipline must act, and that includes the male majority. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And I hope we'll come back to many of the concrete suggestions you were making there in the discussion. So thank you. And our next speaker is going to be Donna Leong, who's the Director of Economic Statistics at the Office of National Statistics, to offer her perspective on the issues. Donna, over to you.
Thanks very much for inviting me today. And I think I've come with a couple of different hats on today. One, as a sponsor of ongoing work within the GES on gender issues, and two, with my ONS and civil service hat on to consider how we are thinking about gender balance, and also I think my own experiences working as a female economist within the senior civil service. And just to say, you know, I started off my career in the New Zealand Treasury as a trainee analyst, and I would say that I think some of the changes that Misa's talked about in terms of, you know, the increased profile of women is definitely something I've noticed. I think when I first started my career, it wouldn't be unusual for me to go along to a conference on macroeconomics and be one of only a handful of women in the room. I remember going to Bank of England party on, well, a soiree, I think, for key stakeholders. And once again, I think, you know, the dominance of men within the venue, I think, was indicative, I think, of the fact that quite a lot of macroeconomists and indeed senior macroeconomists were and continue to be, I think, male. So looking at the report, I found it really interesting, but I think it's also quite worrying because in the GES, we are really dependent on entry into profession at undergraduate level. And we do know that we have an issue of underrepresentation of women in analytical functions in government, although the gap is smaller in statistics compared to economics. And interestingly, goes the other way in terms of social researchers. Obviously for ONS, we have higher across all the analytical functions. When we undertook a survey of the GES, we found that women, minority ethnic groups, and those with a disability felt less included, were less likely to feel that they had fair opportunities to progress, and also were less likely to believe that the GES would support them in case of any discrimination or harassment. The GES itself was perceived to be dominated at higher grades by those who are white, male, and Oxford educated. Females were also more likely to disagree that staff were treated equally regardless of gender. So while I do appreciate that the figures are perhaps less stark than for academia and that there has been progress, I think there still is a visible gender gap and a perception of bias. Looking at the wider civil service, you do see a high proportion of women there, but once again, I think we need to sort of think about the fact that we have smaller numbers of women entering the profession from an undergraduate level. And some of the issues that people bring up in terms of retention and progression, such as the need to balance caring responsibilities, desire for more flexible part-time working, the lack of senior female role models, or indeed smaller personal networks that they can draw on to progress, are true across the civil service and not just specific to the economics profession. And indeed, I would say that civil service is more accommodating of flexible working. We've got some very high profile, for example, job share partners at high levels within the service, including at Director General level. We've obviously also got some very visible role models for the GES, with Claire Lombardelli and Sam Beckett as co-chairs of the GES. And as I think consistent with the figures that Mies has pointed out, the numbers of women in the senior civil service have also been increasing, although we still have a gender gap in terms of seniority and also in pay. So the Gender in the GES initiative was created in January 2018 with the aim of promoting diversity within the economics profession and government. It's got 3 objectives: to increase the share of women applying to study economics at university level, and to increase the share of female economists working in the GES, with the ambition of making it the employer of choice for female economists in the UK. So please come and join us in the GES. And similarly, to increase the share of female economists in the SCS and the GES. And some of the initiatives that we've undertaken, I think, include research looking at what the cause of the problems might be and what potential solutions might be, partnering in outreach, and in particular, I think, encouraging women's interests in economics, including in secondary schools, and then retention and progress, and thinking about really practical solutions to help women tackle some of the issues that they see as relating to progression, including focusing on confidence and personal impact, for example. Looking at ONS, we have a commitment to reduce gender inequality and to be a more diverse and inclusive organisation. And most notably, we were rated a top 30 employer for working families in 2021. And we have seen an increase in women at senior grades, and that's helped reduce our gender pay gap. So around 40% of the SCS within the ONS now are female. But interestingly, you do see gender patterns playing out. For example, during the pandemic, we saw an increase in our bonus pay gap in favour of men. And the explanation for that was because women, in light of the pandemic, increased focus on their caring commitments and cut back on their hours. And women were more likely to pick up the opportunities that were created by the pandemic, with the ONS, for example, introducing really new and innovative ways of gathering data around what was happening in terms of COVID infections. And so this work was seen as more extraordinary and deserving of a bonus, and that actually increased our bonus pay gap. So in summary, I think what I would say is that the GES, the civil service, and I think the ONS have recognised gender imbalance as an issue, and it's very much a live topic for the civil service as a whole in terms of how to increase diversity. And I think, not just that in terms of women, but recognising the intersectionality, I think, that was referred to, particularly around, say, Black women or working class males, for example. And we are tackling that in different ways. But I think the thing that I take from your report was that if we can't get women to enter the economics profession and encourage them to study at undergraduate level, despite the carrot of it being by far the highest earning degree, then I'm really interested to think about how we can continue, to make the progress that Mies and I have referred to within the civil service, and as well as in academia.
Thank you very much, Donna. So again, lots of issues that we can pick up in the discussion part of the panel. So I'm going to turn to our third panelist now, Nina Banks. She joins us. She's president of the National Economic Association and professor at Bucknell University in the United States. So we're going to get a transatlantic view, but I'm very curious, Nina, to get your perspective on the report and on the wider issues. So over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to the Royal Economic Society for inviting me to talk about academic initiatives regarding women in the United States, especially those who are underrepresented based on race and gender. The National Economic Association was created in 1969 as the Caucus of Black Economists to address the extreme underrepresentation of Black economists. NEA members have been responsible for the formation of the American Economic Association Summer Pipeline Program, and that's our main pipeline program. It started in 1974 for undergraduates from underrepresented groups who are interested in entering into doctoral programs in economics. And according to economist Susan Collins, it was NEA concerns that led to the formation of the Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economics Profession, CIMGAP, also in 1974. Each of these two programs focus on underrepresented groups of both women and men, since the number of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous economists is extremely low, regardless of gender. According to CIMGAP's most recent report from December of 2020, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous women's representation was highest among women at the bachelor's and master's level, where they represented a little bit more than 19% of degrees conferred to women in economics, compared to just 8.1% at the doctorate level. Looking specifically at the doctoral level, Latinx women received 5.4% of all doctorates awarded to women who were citizens and permanent residents. Black women received just 2.68%, and Indigenous women received 0% of doctoral degrees awarded to women in this category. My own initiatives on increasing the number of women in economics have been through the American Economic Association, the AEA committee work, through efforts taken at my university, through mentoring Black women, including Black Latinx women, and through my research and course offerings. Until a few months ago, I was on a task force for the American Economic Association for outreach to high school and undergraduate students in economics. Its aim is to increase the number of women and underrepresented men in economics. And I was on a subcommittee that focused on issues of curriculum and outreach at the undergraduate level, since I think that is where the main problem occurs. And so I want to echo what Donna just stated about the importance of what takes place at the undergraduate level. At my university, I mentored junior women in the department by providing advice on teaching and on ways to balance their course load with scholarship. Additionally, I initiated a conversation among women in the department that led to the formation of the Bucknell Women in Economics Club for our students. And currently 37% of our majors are women, which is slightly above the national average. We had a very successful launch in spring 2020, and then of course we went remote in March of 2020. But we plan to restart the club this semester. When we launched our club initially, we invited all of the women who were majors, as well as women in our principles of economics classes who had not yet declared their major. Our goals are to increase the number of women in the major through a variety of tactics that include peer mentoring and mentoring by women faculty, providing networking and social opportunities, and providing more advice on curricular, internship, career, and higher education opportunities. Specific ideas include having panels of women alums, having more women economists as speakers on campus, and providing opportunities for our women students to engage with them through dinner or lunch, having research talks by women majors, and social events that enable networking and bonding that include afternoon coffee and tea, late night exam cram hangouts, and career panels on internships and graduate school. We also discussed the possibility of having a senior award for a woman or two women's within the major whose work lifted up her peers. We talked about having a special graduation event for women, and even experimenting with having an all women principles of econ section taught by women faculty. I've also mentored Black women in economics. I have done this through both formal and informal means. Formally, I did it by being paired with a junior Black woman through a program called Diversity Initiative for Tenure in Economics, started by Rhonda Sharp and Sandy Darity, that tries to enable underrepresented faculty to successfully move through the tenure process. Informally, I very recently mentored a junior Black woman economist who, like me, is a heterodox economist, and I frequently direct media requests that I receive to other Black women, especially junior women, in order to provide them with greater opportunities to have their research gain exposure. Last summer, I developed a research project for a Black woman undergraduate at a different university who wanted to work with me because of my heterodox research on Black women, because it resonated with her. We met weekly throughout the summer for 8 weeks. It was a high impact learning experience for her, and I'm gratified to see that she is in fact applying to graduate programs right now, in fact, in the UK. And finally, through my research and the courses that I teach, I have always tried to illuminate the economic lives of women whose work is often unseen and unheralded. And I believe that undergraduate women are more likely to connect to economics as a discipline when they see a more accurate representation of themselves as well as other women within it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. And again, lots of points I think we can return to. Our final panelist is Emilia Lazarova from the University of East Anglia. I think fittingly, she's an academic in the UK, of which this report is predominantly about, but obviously we've heard all these other views too. So Emilia, over to you to give us your perspective.
Thank you, Tim. I would like to congratulate and thank the Royal Economic Society's Women's Committee on the continuous attention and reporting on through the gendered lens on a variety of issues. Just before we started this session, Victoria mentioned the fact that I was brave being here because academics are not coming out very good in the report. And I never thought of that this way. I'd like to think that I'm not defined by what's been, but what I can do. And what I can do is more being armed by the numbers that Victoria and her co-authors have provided me with. Using these reports to understand better my professional environment and equip myself with the knowledge of the trends, gaps, and priority has been and still is invaluable to me. As head of School of Economics at UEA, I'm very proud to be the head of school of the first department in economics back in the day to receive the Athena Swan Award for our work on gender equality. But that work hasn't stopped and has a lot to achieve still. As head of School of Economics, I have many responsibilities, but two of these lie closer to my heart and the core of why I decided to take on the role. The first one is to deliver on a university mission to make a difference to young people's life. And the second one is to cultivate an academic environment that stimulates ambition for an impact in our discipline. So how does the numbers that Victoria shared with us and past reports by the Women's Committee have helped me guide my projects through the years? Of course, they act as a barometer. They help me understand where my department is vis-a-vis the others, and they provide a powerful and striking message that tells me about the big picture. And I will refrain myself from giving you more numbers now and just maybe speak about what it is on the ground. And that's been my brief, a head of school perspective on the gender experience of students of economics as well as female faculties of economics. We need to remind ourselves why we care about these numbers to begin with. To me, there are two answers. Number one, because we know that the gendered experience that women have helps shape perspective and set of knowledge that are an invaluable resource to us all. And we cannot afford missing that resource. And number two, on mere fairness grounds. If girls and women are missing from our subject because they don't have access to it, then this is simply wrong and needs to be put right. So let me start with the point of access to economics. I fully agree that we need to talk about students and welcome the addition of the student perspective in the reporting by the Women's Committee. In fact, when we at UEA first started thinking about access, we launched our first event by targeting what here in the UK maybe is the first time pupils start thinking about the possibility of studying economics. And this is when they choose their A-levels. They choose their A-levels with a desire to potentially pursue a specific career, or just based on the curiosity they have developed about the world around them. I'd like to reassure you that given the numbers that we have, the number of A-level students have been increasing. It doesn't seem to be a signal that suggests that the access to A-level studies is particularly problematic. But I would like to ask you to do the following thought experiment. Imagine yourself at the age of 16, sitting in a room where there were only two other people of your gender, fellow classmates, and you're being taught by a teacher who is also not of your gender. And think about how you would feel in that environment. And maybe this is part of the answer why we see so few home economics female students and more of the international female students. And this is because in most of the other parts of the world, we do not do A-level economics. And in fact, none of the top UK university and departments of economics require A-level economics for entry to their degree. Well, that's fair enough. We do not require A-level economics, but our pupils at the age of 16 would like to have a bit of taste of economics before they commit themselves to it. So given that we know how important A-level economics experience is for entry to the university, what should we do? I think that a new female Avenger with economic superpowers will probably do the trick, but don't know how to achieve that. Short of that, the Royal Economic Society Discover Economics campaign is really good, as well as universities like ours and many others who are really trying to bridge this gap to students before they have chosen their A-level economics. But there is something else that we can do. I'll give you one number, and this is the number of teacher training programs that teach teachers of A-level economics. So how many institutions provide a certificate for A-level economics teachers? That's my question. And that in the whole of the UK is 10. There is none in Scotland, none in Wales, none in Northern Ireland. There are about 4 in Southeast England and other 5 around the Midlands and just 1 in the North. And in terms of our data, we know that since 2015 up until 2020, most of the time, the recruitment on this program has fallen short of the government's target. In some years, below 30%, and only 1 year, it has gone a little bit above target. So what can we do to encourage economics teachers to get the certificate and become passionate economics teacher and become the role models that maybe the female students are missing? Well, in STEM subjects where there has been traditionally such lack of teachers, there have been bursaries. So there have been incentives, monetary incentives. So this may be something that we can think about as offering. But something else that we can do in terms of role modeling is not only to trumpet the success of female economists across the board, is also to open the eyes of the young people towards the wide variety of professions female economists do, and to make sure that the status of this profession is being recognized as success. That is, move away from the stereotypical economist doing work in finance. We've just heard from our other panelists how many female economists there are in the government economic service in the Bank of England, and there are still many doing wonderful work in NHS and in the local authorities, and we need to trumpet their success as well. And this actually takes me back to my first question. The question on if we know that gendered experience and perspective is valuable to us, and this is the one big reason we want to encourage female economists, how do we make sure that we reward that gendered experience and perspective? The question to me as head of school, chairing promotions committee, is about making sure that success is not based on the stereotypical male academic CV, making sure that this gendered perspective that adds to the conversation, stimulates debate, and maybe on different platforms, is still valued and rewarded. How we define success and making sure that success is not stereotypically male is important not only for me as a head of school, but I think it is important in the wider academic profession, to editors and chairs of professional organizations. And in addition to that, as chair of promotions committee, it is important that we face the reality that gendered experience means that women have different experience. Women give birth, they have maternity leave. And we need to put on the table transparently and clearly the fact that these experiences would impact on their work-life balance, and make sure that we take this into account in our assessment of their promotions documents in a fair and transparent way, and we do not ask them to wait that bit longer because they've had a career break. So just to wrap up, I actually feel that I am in a privileged position, in a position where I can make a difference by treating others a different way than maybe I have been treated myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilia. So I invite the panelists all to put their cameras on, and we can look like a panel together. So let me begin by coming back to Victoria and asking her a question, perhaps a kind of a little bit of the so what question. I mean, in what ways do you think our understanding of the economy or policy are impacted by lack of diversity in general, but particularly by the gender imbalance?
So I'd probably at this point to the work of feminist economists, and feminist economists argue that the problem is not women, the problem is economics. That typically when we look at economics, we think of economics as being gender neutral. We think of the agents in our models, we think of the approaches that we take in our models, we think of the things we measure as being gender neutral. But what feminist economics suggests is that the assumptions we make, the questions we ask as economists, the data that we collect and how we collect it, and the approaches we choose to value, such as perhaps maths over history, that those things actually are not gender neutral, and that those choices about how we do those things are rooted in a history of economics that has tended to be very male dominated. And that what we have as a result is an economics that cannot find answers to questions, to problems that minorities face. Now, whether that's women, whether it's other minorities, that we've been looking at the economy through a lens that hasn't appreciated what's going on out there in the world. And of course, the problem is if you do that, then you create a vicious circle, because what we know is that if economics isn't connected to people's lives, if it's not connected to the real world, then they're less likely to be attracted to doing it. I mean, there was an interesting study published just last year in the Journal of Economics Education by Amanda Bayer et al. That looked at a new course. It enrolled 400 students, it achieved gender balance. And the argument that's made in this paper is that it was able to do that by actually connecting to people's real world experiences and connecting the material to students, to minority students. So if we have an economics that is failing to address issues of concern, particularly to minorities, we don't attract minorities. The result is those issues continue to be overlooked, and fewer minorities, including women, are attracted to the subject. So then, how do we break out of that? You can take an approach of lean in, or you can take an approach of lean out. We can look at economics as it is now, and we can try and encourage it to do the best that it possibly can, such as, for example, trying to break what we see as myths. The Discover Economics campaign at the Royal Economic Society tries to do that. Or we can take another more radical approach, which is thinking hard as economists what we value, maths versus other things, how we collect the data, who we prioritize when we do that, the types of questions that we ask, the interdisciplinary nature. I think the interdisciplinary nature has tended to be looked down on within economics, which is a great shame. So do we lean in, do we lean out? I think at an individual level, the rational thing to do is to lean in. If we want to achieve something more radical, it takes us working as a collective to do that. So it takes women, minorities coming together to do that.
Thank you, Victoria. And sort of a related question to Nina, who's written a history, I believe, of the life of Sadie Alexander, who you'll explain, I hope, in your answer, who she was. But this is a quote from your book. Sadie Alexander's economics should be a source of inspiration to all economists and people who are interested in economic issues and economic policies beyond Black women. So maybe you could just say a word or two about who she was and why you viewed things in the way that quote suggests.
Sure. Thank you, Tim. Sadie Alexander was the first African-American economist. She received her doctorate in 1921 from the University of Pennsylvania, along with two other women that year who became the first Black women to get doctorate degrees. But no one in the United States, Black or white, was prepared to hire a Black woman with a doctorate degree. So she ended up becoming a lawyer. She died in 1989, and her economics was completely lost. We assumed that she had given up her interest in economics. And then I started doing archival research in 2003, discovered this treasure trove of speeches, analyzed them, reinterpreted them, and eventually, about 20 years later, managed to publish a book of her speeches and writings. And as Victoria was talking, I kept nodding because I kept thinking about Sadie Alexander in the context of what you were saying. She was a broadly trained, to go to your point, Tim, she was a broadly trained economist. She was trained as an institutionalist, interdisciplinary, connected to the social sciences and humanities, not just math, although she used statistics, but from a descriptive standpoint. And, to go to your question about, why it's problematic, why everybody should be interested in what she had to say, is that research by Evelyn Forget indicates that the early women economists were broadly trained, but were often pigeonholed into a really narrow focus on women's issues. When they were able to get published, it was usually in terms of women's issues. And so I really try to resist narrowly thinking about Sadie Alexander's economics in terms of women's issues. And she did talk about women, but but she was very broad. And so that was not her main concern. And so we should all be concerned about the things that she was talking about, because it's the things that we are concerned about today: systemic or structural oppression. She talked about economic rights. The book is called Democracy, Race, and Justice, because she was concerned about large issues affecting people in terms of access to jobs that paid livable wages, interested in economic insecurity and how that could undermine the rule of law. So I think that she is a really good illustration of the need to rethink our basic assumptions about how we do economics, archival research, qualitative research that is necessary to, to dig up these missing voices, as well as to rethink, what it means to be an economist.
Thanks, Nina. And I'll go to questions from the floor in a minute, but I'd be curious to get the perspective from Misa and Donna in terms of working not in academia, but do you feel that, again, the way the agenda is shaped in the Government Economic Service or the Bank of England, does diversity change the way those debates would happen? Do you feel?
Do I go first? Yes, I very much think so. And I think that required leadership, really. I think what was really important is that leaders, those in leadership positions, that I'm talking about the governors, have repeatedly and loudly talked about diversity issues over several years. And they have initiated a series of actions until things started filtering into across the organization. It has to be done that way. And this is why when we organized this panel with Victoria, I said, I would like him to come to this panel, because you sit at the top of the Royal Economic Society, and we need people in those top positions to initiate and support any sort of diversity actions. Otherwise, I think nothing will change, really.
Good. And Donna, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that Victoria made before around diversity contributing to stronger economics, I think that's even more true for policy making and having a range of perspectives and a range of data, to make those decisions and to think about the different experience of people. I mean, and I think, for example, in ONS, we've just recently published the work of Inclusive Data Task Force, which highlights, the need, to make sure that, we are taking account and measuring, different people's experiences, because unless we have that evidence, then it's actually really hard to make policy that relates to that experience. And I think it takes, I mean, I'm not saying, for example, Tim, that you as a white male can't necessarily put yourselves in the shoes of someone else with a different experience, but I think it just makes it a bit easier to take that into account and to think about it. I think, the book by Invisible Woman kind of highlights, I think, very much so, how sometimes you can just, you cannot really be aware of your own unconscious bias when you are thinking about policy making.
Interesting. And a couple of comments. One topic I've become very interested in recently is what's called descriptive representation in politics, and it goes exactly to your last point, Donna. That is it feasible for someone to really, without the lived experience of someone they're representing, say, to be able to then become an authoritative legislator over the issues that those people. And there's a big debate, as you mentioned, in political science, to what extent that really is possible. And I'll make one other point about the Royal Economic Society, and I take no credit for this at all, but we were looking at data from the Council of the Royal Economic Society recently, and it turns out of the 30 council members, at this point 19 are women, but that it's interesting because they are voted for by the members of the Royal Economic Society, suggesting that at least among that group there is a concern for these kinds of issues. We have a question in the chat, which I'm going to direct to Emilia, about Athena Swan. And that you mentioned it, I think, in your presentation, and perhaps I think everyone on the call probably knows what that is, but perhaps just begin by explaining that. But how do you think Athena Swan has contributed to gender and other kinds of diversity in academia more generally, but perhaps from the perspective of your department, Emilia?
Well, thank you for this question. I think that Athena Swan asked of us to reflect, and this is really the biggest contribution, is to start the conversation, to force the conversation in, especially when you're in the minority. And it asked of us to reflect on our own experiences in a critical way. I think it is very easy to accept the established rules and ways of being assessed and evaluated. And especially when you are a junior member of staff and in the minority, you don't think there is any other way. And Athena Swan asked us to think about, is this actually right? Is it right that we are not reflecting on how career break is being accommodated in the timeline for promotion or not? And I'm going to talk about the career break because it is so obvious, isn't it? If you take a year off to have a child, should you wait for a year to be confirmed in post? And is it actually fair to ask you to wait for a year to have a child or to be confirmed in post? And to me, the answer is actually no. It shouldn't. We should be finding a reasonable way to which we all agree on how we are going to compare apples and oranges, because at the end of the day, in terms of childbearing, we are apples and oranges, and just confronting it. So Athena Swan helped us prioritize the thinking, as well as the looking at the numbers. And this is where really Victoria's report, current report, but also the past reports from the Women's Committee was so invaluable to start this conversation and start benchmarking ourselves against others.
Thank you. I have another question coming out of the chat, which is related to the numbers, it's sort of indirectly, and that's a question around the Hazer data, which for the first time we've had brought in this report. But of course, that data also shows that STEM subjects have made much more progress than economics. So we don't just learn about economics, but we can learn about economics comparatively. And it's something I puzzled over. I have my pet views, and I'm not going to share them as I'm not a panelist, I'm just a chair. But I'd be very curious to hear from the panel, you know, why they think it is that economics hasn't made the kind of progress that other so-called STEM subjects have made. I don't know if anyone wants to begin answering that. I don't know if someone has a view that they'd like to share with us on that.
I could speak a little bit. I mean, I think one reason could be, this is just speculation, is but economics is more subjective than science. And therefore, the views of the editors and referees strongly make a difference on whoever submit the papers, right? I think there are studies that suggest that women are treated differently, even in journal refereeing process. I mean, I think those are the kind of issues that really need to be looked at more closely by those who occupy top position in the profession, to see if there's actually an issue there.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, Donna?
Yeah, I mean, I think I thought it was really interesting. And in the ONS, we draw upon a range of analytical functions: economics, operational research, digital and data, social research, and so forth. I mean, actually, although they'll probably all pillory, I mean, we ask them, there's a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of benefit to that kind of a multidisciplinary approach that sort of borrows from each. But it is striking that for example, social researchers, the number of women is much higher than in economics, even though in some ways you might say the tools of the trade look quite similar. Use of data, thinking, and the crossover, for example, in terms of behavioural economics is obviously quite strong. So I think there's definitely room, I think, for research in terms of looking at, closely, aligned professions and thinking about, well, where are the differences arising? Is it just because one is seen as being more, popular for women? I just think social research there might be relative to economics, which might be seen as a, notwithstanding Lisa's comment, a harder social science in some ways. So I think there's definitely an area to start looking at really across the analytical functions.
Thank you.
I think
Now I noticed Richard, sorry, I'll come to you in a second, Victoria, because this might take a second to resolve, but Richard Toll has his hand up, but I've no idea whether he can be unmuted or whether yes, he can. So he's going to ask a question. But Victoria, you wanted, before we come to you, Richard, just give us a second, because I think Victoria also wanted to respond on that.
Yeah, just really to sum up what the two previous speakers have said, I think the first issue is that economics is to a degree late to the table when it comes to recognizing and addressing the problem of lack of diversity in the subject area. And I think secondly, the nature of economics is in some ways different to things like the physical sciences. We're dealing with people. That does provide a more social backdrop to it. And I think what's really interesting is if we were to look at those who are studying what we should really think of as economic areas, in sociology departments, in economic history departments, in psychology departments, in philosophy departments, in gender studies departments, there were actually lots of women there doing, working on important economic questions, but that economists don't really take ownership of. They see what they're doing as not economics, as somehow too soft relative to what true economists do. So I think actually there's lots of really interesting work going on, but we need to reach out. We need to be much more interdisciplinary. And I think actually if we were to do that, the picture would in some ways look more hopeful. But that requires fundamental change in how we see ourselves as economists and what we value as economic research.
Thank you. So Richard, if you could unmute and ask your question.
Yes, I can unmute. All 5 speakers argue for rather soft approaches, and I want to share an incident with you. Recently, a colleague was denied tenure, and it's a bit of a complicated case. Both the dean and the pro-vice chancellor who are responsible for this decision have a history of misogyny, in the proper sense of the word, not how Dominic Raab thinks it is defined. But the stated reason why she was denied tenure was that her papers did not move fast enough through peer review. And Misa already alluded to this. There is now, I think, solid empirical evidence that female-authored papers are indeed delayed in peer review. So I have come to the conclusion that the only way to remedy this is positive discrimination. I absolutely hate discrimination of any sort, and I really do not like to come to this conclusion, but I think that the probation criteria for men and women should be different, because we know that the market treats them differently. I also know that there is stigmatization involved with positive discrimination, but I think it's worth the price. And I would like to hear the perspective of the panelists on this, but particularly Emilia.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I'm going to go to Nina and Emilia on this, and then I'll invite the other panelists. So Nina, do you have a view about positive discrimination?
I don't even know what positive discrimination is. Do you mean affirmative action? What do you mean by positive discrimination?
Affirmative action, yes.
Well, affirmative action is not discrimination. It's inclusion of people who have always been excluded. Now, I'm not sure how how do you translate that into publishing, right? And so I think that with publishing, one of the key issues is the editors and the editorial process, which of course needs to be much more inclusive, so that people who it's the editors and the associate editors as well, and there needs to be a large body of people who have sufficient knowledge on the subject as well, who read it and understand the contribution. So it's a really complex issue, and so if you mean affirmative action in terms of getting more people who are on editorial boards, then I think that, yeah, that is absolutely critical.
Emilia.
Yes, thank you, Richard. I think that I understand the language of the positive discrimination coming from the UK higher education institutional system, where this is a no, no, no. You can't take an action that is going to disproportionately value somebody over somebody else in protected categories. But I would say, Richard, that the approach that I'm taking isn't soft. I think that I'm making a brave step by saying that in terms of the clock of tenure, I'm ready to speak about comparing oranges to apples, and I have already done that already in my practice. And how are we going to achieve this? This is by broadening the metrics that we are using in terms of the quality and quantity of the publication. So we want to talk about how the published work has opened a debate, has already received attention, what other evidence of the esteem of this work we can bring about the conversation. So it is about moving away from a fixed journal list ranking and bringing in, being more inclusive in that way, other evidence of the external validation of the individual's work. And yeah, I'm sorry that your colleague is finding themselves in this situation, but I think there is a way of addressing these issues.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on this?
I can quickly talk about, I mean, what I think Richard is talking about is target, perhaps, and how do academia think about targets? And I think it's been controversial when the bank first introduced it, but I think it might be worth debating that, whether targets are needed in academic professions as well. And Tim, you have done your own research about gender quota as well, which, you know, produced some very interesting results, that it actually increased competency. So it's worth having that debate, I think.
Thank you. Okay, we have another interesting question. I'll read it out in full. From Fabio Arisho, who's I think a colleague of Emilia, probably. Anyway, he says, while listening to conversations about gender, ethnicity, and orientation, there's a side of the debate that claims that cis white males should just shut up and listen for once. I surely understand the position and the ground on which it builds. I'm prepared to do it. But I do welcome the statement Tanaka made at the end of her intervention. Female underrepresentation is something male economists should be more involved and more proactively. What can men do in a more active way to address this issue? How can they act supportively, yet not reclaiming or taking ownership of the process? I would hope that a good representation of men attending this talk. So I'm curious to know whether any of our panelists have a response to that.
I can respond to that. I mean, men absolutely need to be involved, I think, especially because this profession is heavily occupied by men, and without them, things are not going to move. I think, so that's why I think as an institution, whether it's at the university level or at Royal Economic Society level, action plans supported by both men and women need to be drawn up to make any change. And I think having male allies in the process will make a big difference in terms of speed of progress.
Any other comments on that? Victoria,
Yeah,
you've unmuted.
I think something that has become powerfully clear to me over the last few years is that not every woman is a feminist and not every man is a misogynist. So, you know, certainly we can't trust in, you know, we can't hope that just if we get more women at the top, that suddenly that will improve things for all women, you know, down to the bottom. And we can't assume that men are our enemies. You know, men can very much be our allies. So I think that's the first point I'd made, and that in terms of practical things, we have this thing called bystander training when it comes to, abuse and harassment. And I think, very much I would welcome men in the economics profession who call out and who stand up to macho culture, to bullying, and who whistleblow. I think that's a really important thing that men can be doing. And the other thing is there is a lot of invisible work that we do. And I mean, Nina Banks has talked about the amazing amount of work that she is doing to support women and minorities in economics. And all of that takes such a lot of time. And a lot of that type of work is put on women. And because we're such a small part of the population, that is quite a lot to carry. So, that's another area I think where it would be great to see more male involvement.
Any other thoughts on this topic? Nina, do you have a response to that?
I echo what Victoria said, and just to say that, a really important role that men within the academy can play is to reward, to see that invisible work, and then to reward it in the tenure process. I mean, this goes to Emilia's point about apples and oranges as well. Women are performing all kinds of unseen, really important work, and we need to be evaluated on that in the tenure process. Service usually is ranked very low compared to scholarship and teaching. And so there's a bias against the type of really important work that women are performing, in terms of diversity. Universities have the goal of diversity, and yet are not rewarding women sufficiently for it.
Thanks. And Emilia, I see you switch your microphone again. Is that you want to comment on this?
It is just to actually commend Fabio's work at UEA. We actually started our work in what was called, we call it now EAD, which is the Equality and Diversity in Economics Committee. And Fabio is a member of that committee, incredibly valuable, an incredible role model who in his class of first year intro to macroeconomics students goes there with a slide and talks about really a zero tolerance to racial, gender, and any sorts of discrimination, and being really a powerful voice. So Fabio, what you're doing is incredibly valuable to really cultivate the community for us, and just be the example for others.
Okay, thank you. So we're getting very close to the final time now. We've had some great questions and really insightful comments from our panel. So it really remains for me to thank you. I don't know if anyone has a sort of parting remark, maybe Victoria. I mean, as you know, Victoria, the Royal Economic Society is very committed to this. We now, in our silver anniversary, which is, I guess, 25 years of doing work in this space. Some will say that's not long enough because it took us, it's only 25 years ago that people started really waking up to this. But all the same, the society is committed for the long term until the problem is resolved. And who knows how long that will be. But Victoria, any parting thoughts on the agenda going forward?
Yeah, probably that we can't approach this as individuals. We have to come together. We have to work as a collective. And of course, the Royal Economic Society as a body is one way in which we can hope to achieve that. So thank you for the support and the work that you're doing, and let's keep on doing it. And let's try and not be too pessimistic. Let's look for hope. To achieve that utopia of gender balance.
Yeah, and I think my takeaway from this is definitely a half full, not a half empty takeaway. That it's an uplifting thing to listen to the initiatives. They're not enough, and we're not making the progress we all are hoping we can make. But I also think the tone of the conversation has been a positive one. It's about what we can do, not what we fail in doing. And lots of thoughts from all of our panel. So it's just down for me to thank Victoria, Misa, Donna, Nina, and Emilia for sharing your time, for giving your time this afternoon and sharing your thoughts. and this project is far from done, but thanks for helping us push ahead this very important agenda.